it's all in some sense about childhood environment.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy.
Professor James Davenport.
Dr. Guy Crane, how are you today?
A little frazzled. Long to-do list. This is kind of in the middle of a busy day.
Yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out that next week is spring break for us, and I don't know about you, but I'm already tired enough for that to be true.
I am definitely ready for spring break. I did actually cut up on all my grading. So
now for you, that's miraculous. This is not something you normally do.
Of course, I've got an assignment that's due, that was due last night. So now I'm going to have to spend some time grading that. But,
do you have spring break plans?
Yes. I'm getting knee surgery over spring break.
Oh, man,
so.
That just sounds like a blast.
Yeah, no,
if only we could trade.
I told you the story about going on this hike with my daughter and kind of messed it up. It was already had some issue. Not everybody asks, you going to get replaced? No, I'm not that old yet. But just getting some arthroscopic stuff done, cleaning up some tears in the meniscus and whatnot.
Ouch.
So.
I saw a meme the other day that I should have sent you then. The meme was showing a kid jumping out of a swing, and it says, do you remember when we used to jump out of swings as kids? Those knees were fresh out of the box.
Right. Yes, that is true. There's no going to be jumping out of swings for me for a while.
Those days are over.
Well, listen, we have a fantastic guest on the show today. We're very excited. Let me introduce him as Dr. Benjamin Goldman. He's an assistant professor of economics in the Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University. He is also a research affiliate at Opportunity Insights, the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, the Cornell Population Center, and Ed Redesign. Dr. Goldman's research focuses on labor and public economics with an emphasis on race and class-based economic disparities in the United States. He earned his master's degree and PhD in economics from Harvard University and his bachelor's degree in economics from Macalester College. Dr. Goldman, or Benny, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you both for having me. And I have to say, James, I sympathize with the knee injury. I made the grave mistake of tearing my Achilles last year, right before the academic job market. So poor timing and not a great injury.
That's rough. Yes. Oh man, don't envy that at all. You know, you get a certain age, and I guess you just start. But I haven't had that much trouble, so I shouldn't complain.
I thought that age would be higher than 30, but
yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So he's a baby.
Wow.
You know. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that, but you know,
that's true.
You know,
in more ways than age. Sorry.
Yeah. We've got some rapid fire get to know you questions we're going to start off with, and then we'll get into the heart of some of the research that you've done and questions we have over that. Okay.
Sounds great.
All right. So just right off the bat, how'd you get into academia? What was your road to becoming a professor and a researcher?
I'll try the rapid fire answer to that question, but the short of it is that when I was a college student, I was more or less completely disinterested in school and definitely would have laughed in your face if you told me that I would have opted to do, nearly another decade of schooling after undergrad. What I was very excited about was football. I was a football player in college, a very average, at best, Division III quarterback. And I was particularly excited when I was a student about ways to use statistics to improve strategy in football games. And it was actually through that work that a friend and I, who is now a assistant director of analytics for a Major League Baseball team, actually went to an economics conference because there was a set of presentations we thought would be relevant to the work we were doing in this sports analytics space. And it was at that conference that I saw a presentation by my future advisor, Raj Shetty, that actually convinced me to become an economist. Yeah.
Nice. So do you still follow? Do you do anything in relating to sports still, or is that now you've changed where you're trying to go?
Well, so I definitely continue to, much to my detriment, play intramural flag football, which is what led to the rupture of the Achilles tendon previously mentioned. But I also do dabble and occasionally help a few pro football teams with their statistics operation as kind of a side hustle.
Wow,
yes.
Nice.
Okay, well, what is one interesting thing that you are currently reading, listening to, or watching? Your pick.
Recently, I've been reading actually a lot of pop neuroscience books. So I have a bit of a mindfulness meditation practice I do every day. And I've become very interested in the neuroscience of how all that works and how our brain actually functions. So one person in particular who I read a lot about, or read a lot of work from, I should say, is someone named Robert Sapolsky, who's at Stanford and writes a lot about neuroscience and how it relates to our actions in the world and these concepts such as free will. So in some sense, it's related to policy and my own research, but it's also a personal interest of mine.
Fascinating. Okay. Much easier question now. Who is the greatest economist of all time?
I'm not sure how one would measure great in this domain, but what I'd say is maybe a more productive direction to take this in is who is Benny's favorite economist of all time. From that angle, I'd say I've been extremely lucky, as I mentioned, to work with many of the folks who kind of inspired me to become an economist in the first place. So my advisors as a graduate student at Harvard were Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren, Larry Katz and Claudia Golden, and Jesse Shapiro. And amongst that crew is a bunch of, they're all absolutely top flight people, but they've changed the way we've thought about a lot of topics ranging from political polarization to economic inequality to gender disparities in the labor market and so on. So I've been lucky to work with many of my quote unquote economist heroes. What I'd say, though, is I also owe a lot, I'd say, to Gary Becker, the famous Chicago Nobel laureate who unfortunately passed before I ever had a chance to meet Gary. But I think Gary broaden the scope of what economists work on in an important way to a bunch of non-market domains like the family and crime and discrimination. And I think it'd be hard to imagine that I would have gotten as interested in the field as I did had economists not been working on those topics.
Some of those names you rattled off are folks we've been trying to
low-key network our way,
maybe now that we've got a contact, we can work something like that.
Yeah, let me know if you get a hold of them. It was always, hit or miss in grad school as one of their students. No, I'm just kidding, but they were all excellent advisors. I was lucky to work with each of them.
I will tell you, I've had some email exchanges with Claudia Golden.
We would love to have her on.
She's been responsive every time. I read her book, Career and Family, which I thought was just fantastic, and had some questions. So I emailed her, and then and she was pretty responsive and gave me some good information and some good answers to my questions. But I can't convince her to take the time to spend with us. She's.
Oh, Claudia's amazing. I mean, a Nobel Prize winner. She still signs all these photos people mail her. I'm lucky to call her a friend at this point, but she was just absolutely the most supportive advisor in addition to her typical brilliance. So it's a good person to get on the show if you can.
That's awesome. Hey, what's one thing about your work you wish people understood better?
One thing I wish people ceased to guess or understand about my work is I'd say people sometimes think that if you're working on issues around economic inequality or social mobility, it automatically has a political valence. in some sense, people assume that if you work on these issues, you're doing it from kind of a more left wing or progressive perspective. And I think that actually, that's really not true. I broadly like to think about what my own research and what the team at Opportunity Insights is up to, more about bringing science to the study of economic opportunity and how we can improve outcomes for lower income kids, which I think is kind of a universally held kind of good thing to do. So I wish my thing that I wish people knew is that, it really is more scientific. At least that's the North Star for what we want to do. And it need not have this type of political valence that sometimes people assume is there.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with some political scientists recently, and they were even talking about, the trade-off of being a public intellectual versus just a pure researcher or whatnot. But both of them kind of alluded to the fact that, they do a lot of research, and it's not always the case that their research easily conforms to what their political leanings or their policy preferences might be. And so I think that's always a trap we get into sometimes is both how we perceive the research that people are doing, and then if we are doing the research, trying to make sure that we're approaching it from that, like you said, that science-based approach of what's the best way of looking at these and examining these issues. So very interesting. Okay, what's a belief you hold that puts you at odds with either your peers, colleagues, or family?
I don't know so much as a belief as I'd say one thing that my kind of research brings to the forefront, especially when you work with all types of large scale data and have a good sense of kind of what the numbers on class and mobility are in the US, is you become especially attuned to when people are kind of living in a bubble or out of touch along these class dimensions, right? So I'd say that's one thing that stands out in conversations, because obviously there's a lot of social segregation. Much of my time is spent around other people with fancy degrees. And sometimes you'll hear things in conversations, whether it be, disparaging people who go to certain universities or so on, that just make no sense when you take a broader step back and look at the data and realize, all the people who one is talking about in such a conversation are lucky in a sense, just to have the chance to, for example, go to a four-year college. So I think that's something I'm constantly kind of talking about that and reminding people in conversation to zoom out and have a bit of perspective as to where they stand and how their struggles relate to what else might be going on in the world.
Well, awesome. Why don't we get into the meat of our discussion then? We'd like to focus much of our time today on a paper you co-authored with several other researchers. The paper's called Changing Opportunity. Could you just start by telling us about the origins of this paper? What were the basic questions you were interested in, and how did you go about researching them?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, this is joint work with Raj Chetty, Will Doby, Crystal Yang, all of whom are at Harvard and Opportunity Insights, as well as Sonia Porter, who's at the U.S. Census Bureau. What I'd say is the starting point for this paper is trying to understand differences in intergenerational mobility by race and how those have changed over time. But there's really a set of motivating facts that I think make one interested in the types of trends we document here, which is that going back a few years, there's a kind of precedent to this paper about racial differences in mobility, just in general, not about how they're changing over time. And that paper, which was done by Raj and Nathan Hendren at Harvard and Sonia Porter and Maggie Jones at the Census Bureau, showed that there are these large racial disparities in intergenerational mobility. And I think before going on, it's helpful to describe exactly what's meant by that, which is a racial difference in intergenerational mobility means if you take two kids who grow up in households where their parents earn exactly the same level of income, those kids will go on later in life to have substantial differences in their own earnings. And those differences are meaningful and worth focusing on, because in practice, the only way to think about closing racial disparities in the long run is by eliminating those differences in intergenerational mobility by race. So just to give you some intuition for how this might work, if you always, whenever you take two children whose parents earn the same, if they go on to have differences in earnings later in life, it creates this kind of pernicious cycle, right? Because what happens is if you were to eliminate all racial disparities, say, between Black and white Americans today in the labor market, what will happen is those disparities will reemerge in the next generation if there's these differences in kids' outcomes, even when you're comparing kids whose parents are in the same. And so the starting point for this paper was really the prior paper, which showed that these differences are quite large. So, by the time kids are in their early 30s, there's an earnings difference between Black and white children of, $10,000 or $15,000 per year, even when comparing Black and white kids who grow up with parents at the same level of income. And so then this new paper is really asking, well, okay, how is that disparity of $10,000 or $15,000 per year changing over time?
Before we get too far down the road, I do want to ask, how exactly are you measuring mobility? So walk us through that. What do you, how are you determining that? And then you're defining, I guess, this mobility as you mentioned, a rising differences in incomes between generations, right? So the idea that I might earn more than my parents did, so to speak. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question, James. Definitely worth getting into the details of how these types of statistics are constructed. What we're doing here is working with large-scale administrative data from the Census Bureau and from tax records that give us near universal coverage of every child growing up in the U.S. after the late 70s or so. And so what we do with these data is we're able to link children to their parents, primarily based on dependent claiming on tax forms. So for most kids born in the US, at some point between, before they're age 18, someone will be claiming them on a tax form. So then what we're able to do is measure the income of those folks, whether it be one or two parents who claim you. We call those your parents. In most cases, those are folks' biological parents, but of course, not always. And then what we're able to do is follow those children into adulthood and measure their own earnings later in life. So there's a few ways to summarize then, or just measure overall levels of mobility. The measure we focus on, and I should say in general, you're going to get similar results regardless of the measure, but it's useful just to have, a single simple summary measure, is we focus on the set of children born at, say, the 25th percentile of the parental income distribution. So these are going to be folks who tend to grow up in households where their parents earn, around $30,000 a year of household income. So relatively lower income Americans. And then we ask for kids growing up in households with parents of that income level, what do they themselves end up earning in adulthood? So that's one way you can measure mobility. You could also ask how kids at other percentiles of the income distribution do when they're growing up. You can ask about how kids are doing relative to their own parents and so on. So there's many different ways to come at this. That first measure where we compare kids whose parents have the same earnings percentile and then follow their own earnings into adulthood is the baseline measure we use in this new paper.
And so mobility, so to identify or to say that someone has become upwardly mobile in this sense would be that they would have an income that brings them out of that 25th percentile. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, what I'd say, James, is that we typically don't try and label individual people necessarily as mobile or not. What we're asking about these broader patterns, whether they be for certain places or groups. In other words, we would say, New Orleans, Louisiana has high rates of upward mobility if on average the kids who grow up with low income parents go on to earn, X number of dollars in adulthood.
Sorry to deviate there. I just kind of wanted to dive in and get it, make sure I understood, how you were defining this. Our listeners would as well. So appreciate you kind of bearing with me on that. The findings suggest that economic mobility for white children in lower income families has worsened over time. And how does that compare to trends in other racial or ethnic groups?
Yeah, thanks, James. So it might be helpful just to actually zoom out once more and come back to some of these area level patterns in the U.S., which is to say, from some of the initial data from prior studies, part of what we've seen in those data is that there's a huge amount of variation across different areas of the US. So, in other words, even when you're comparing kids who grew up in households with the exact same parent income level, your chances of rising up as an adult vary a lot across the US. And after those initial data were put out, so that was about 10 or 12 years ago, there was a lot of work being done to understand what the roots of these different patterns are. So, for instance, the upper plain states, for example, suburban Minneapolis, those types of areas in the US tend to have very high rates of upward mobility compared to, say, there's parts of the southeastern US with lower rates of upward mobility. And there was a bunch of work being done trying to trace the historical roots of these patterns. And one theme that emerged from that line of research was that a lot of the kind of roots underlying these differences across places today run very deep. So you can look at things like rates of slavery in the South in the US or redlining boundaries of neighborhoods. And what you'll see is that those older institutions still have some kind of kick in the data today. And so one kind of question that emerges from that research is, well, given that the roots of these kind of differences across space and for different groups seem to run really deep, is it actually possible to see opportunity or the landscape of opportunity change in a short period of time? And so that's a different way kind of we came to these results, is trying to understand in the data we have how opportunity has changed over time. So that's a long-winded way to now come to your question, which is what has happened to opportunity for different groups recently. And I want to make clear what we're doing here is comparing outcomes of kids born in the mid-70s to outcomes of kids born in the mid-90s. So when we're talking about change, that's the kind of unit of change. So you can think of kind of Gen Xers versus millennials, if you will. And as you hinted at, what we saw in that about 15 or 20 year period is that there was a fairly broad-based degradation in outcomes for white children born to lower income parents. So as you referenced, there's been a kind of sharp decline in economic opportunity, in particular for white children born to lower income parents. And I'm happy to get into what has happened for other groups, but maybe I'll leave that there in case you have follow-up questions.
There's a couple of other findings that were really interesting and follow along that. So you the study finds that mobility for low-income white children declined, while mobility for low-income Black children has improved. But then you also found that the economic gaps between white and Black children narrowed for low-income families, but remained stable for high. So this seems to be moving in directions that don't necessarily reflect how a lot of people think what is happening in these areas. And I was hoping you might be able to help us understand what's driving some of the shifts, and what the nature of kind of racial inequality in this area. What does your study tell us about that today?
Yeah, thanks, James. So I think one helpful bit of context is to just ask what these differences in outcomes look like for these groups at the start of our sample period. And so for us, that's going to be the set of Americans born in the year 1978. And what we see for kids born in 1978 is that when you compare a white and Black child who were both born to low-income parents, so both grew up in households where parents earned on average about $30,000 per year, what you see is those kids in adulthood would go on to have differences in their earnings of about $13,000 per year by the time they were around 30 years old. So the white child was earning on average $13,000 more than the Black child. And perhaps, as you referenced, that is kind of consistent with how we think about these issues, in the sense racial differences in earnings and other outcomes in US society are very salient. And what we're showing in this paper is that if you kind of fast forward those data 15 years and do the exact same exercise for children born in the mid-90s, that initial gap of $13,000 has shrunk to $9,500 a year. And so there's been a reduction in that racial difference in mobility of about 25 or 30% over a relatively short, 15, 20-year period. And so that is the kind of key pattern you identified, these shrinking race gaps among children born to lower income parents. It's worth pointing out they've by no means shrunk to zero, right? But these are large and persistent disparities in US society. And so having them, reduce by 30% in just a 20-year period is a serious change. And I think as you kind of hinted at towards the end there, we've seen different sets of outcomes when we look at children born to higher income parents. So the set of facts I was just discussing, that black-white race gap, was for kids born to lower income parents, about $30,000 a year of household income, as I'd mentioned. When we instead look at children born to higher income parents, for white kids in particular, that's where we see this kind of class polarization. And the reason I use that language is because white children born to higher income parents at about the 75th percentile of the distribution, so you should think about kind of the upper middle class, earnings for those children have risen a bit over time. So if you combine these two patterns, what you get is this picture where for white kids, it's becoming increasingly more important how much your parents earn, right? Lower income white kids who grow up in lower income families are doing a bit worse over time. White kids who grow up in higher income families are doing a bit better over time. So the link between kids' own earnings as adulthood and what their parents earned while they were growing up is kind of steepening or tightening, if you will. And then at the same time, you have this improvement in outcomes for Black kids, which means if you zoom in on those lower income families, the racial disparity amongst lower income kids will be shrinking. So yes, there's a lot going on in the data, but I think one pithy way to summarize it is in that kind of subtitle of the paper title, which is growing class gaps and shrinking race gaps.
Well, that's interesting. I would like to go back to this issue of geography, if we can. I found that really interesting. As I was even reading some of this, I'm thinking about just sort of the commonplace tropes you hear about rust belts in formerly thriving industrial zones, or, for those people who are born in the Midwest, if you want big money and big opportunities, you need to go to one of the coasts, the East or West Coast, and get you somewhere to be in the big city. You all in the study looked at some of these issues, not just the coast, but also Rust Belt areas, as well as burgeoning cities. You mentioned Charlotte and Atlanta specifically. Can you tell us what you found out generally about the relationship between economic mobility and location?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should also say for folks interested in exploring these data on your own, if you go to opportunityatlas.org, there's kind of a dynamic map where you can look at all these patterns that I'm describing in terms of how white and Black and other races are doing at given levels of the parent income distribution and how those patterns are changing over time. But just to come back to your question, I think at the beginning of our sample period, so for kids born in 1978, you see these kind of broad differences across the US. Say we're just looking at white children born to low-income parents, for instance. You can see that opportunity in terms of where are the best places for those kids to grow up in terms of their outcomes in adulthood. You really see kids growing up, for instance, in parts of the Upper Plains states, Minneapolis, North Dakota, parts of Iowa, and then again, parts on the coast. So parts of the Northeast, parts of Arizona, New Mexico, California. Those are kind of the places that previously for kids born in 1978 offered the kind of higher rates of upward mobility, at least for white children. And then what we're able to do, and I should say that's kind of an established fact in this literature. So those data have been around for about 10 or 15 years. What we're able to do in this new paper is, again, fast forward that kind of map, if you will, and ask, well, what do these patterns look like for kids born in the 90s? And there is where you see the differences that may or may not fit with people's kind of intuition, as you were saying, about Rust Belt cities and so on. Because what's happening is that in the late 70s, at least for white children born to lower income parents, you saw, I think, the pattern that, folks are used to seeing in a way, where in parts of the industrial Midwest and Appalachia and parts of the rural South, those were the areas where white children born to low income parents had the worst outcomes. And what's happened over this 15-year period is actually those places have really stayed exactly where they were. They were already doing poorly and they really haven't gotten worse, to be frank. What's instead happened is there's parts of the coast, so there's parts of California, there's much of the Northeast, where in some sense the American dream was really alive and well, at least for white children born to low-income parents. And now those areas have rates of upward mobility that look exactly like parts of Appalachia and the industrial Midwest and the Southeast United States. So that is what the kind of geography of these changes look like, at least for white children born to lower income parents. And happy to talk about the patterns for other groups as well.
One of the things that your study found that I was particularly interested in was that children's economic opportunities were very much related to the environments they grew up in, not just geography, but what employment rates were like in their neighborhoods and such. So could you say a little bit more about that and explain, whether these relationships were the same across racial or class lines and where they might have differed?
Yeah, so I think it might be helpful to taking a step back. What we've seen at the national level is these what I termed growing class gaps and shrinking race gaps. That is, for low income kids, worsening outcomes for white children, some improvement for Black children, and again, improving outcomes for white kids born to higher income parents. One can take those patterns and kind of ask, well, they could really be driven by one of two things. It could be something different about kind of the environment in which those kids grow up in that impacts their life trajectory. Maybe it makes them more likely to go to college or get more education, improves their performance when they're adults in the labor market. A different and I think distinct explanation is that this is really all about what's going on when folks are adults and they enter the labor market. And so perhaps what's driving these patterns is that labor market conditions have worsened in, say, the types of occupations that working class white folks tend to work in, right? And what we find in the data is that it's really, in some sense, for explaining the changes over this period, it's all in some sense about childhood environment. That is, what you can show is that you can kind of fully explain in a statistical sense the differences between these groups and how they've evolved at the national level if you focus back on the environments in which they grew up in. And as you hinted at, James, the measure we use or we focus on to make that calculation is this notion of employment rates of the adults who grew up around. So this is actually, in some sense, inspired by the famous sociologist William Julius Wilson. He had this famous book, When Work Disappeared, that said, when jobs go away in a community, there's a bunch of downstream effects on kind of crime and family dissolution and so on. And this can, of course, impact kind of what it means or what it's like to grow up in such a place. And what we see is that these, for example, the declining outcomes for white kids born to low income parents, those are all concentrated in the parts of the country where white working class white families, where employment rates have declined in those families over the period in which we study these data.
One of those factors you talk about, employment, did this vary along any of these groups, or was there a particular group that was more positively or negatively impacted? You talked about the white working class. What about some of the other groups that you examined? And are there? I know some research, and we're probably going to get into this when we talk a little bit about your other paper here, but about family structure or things like that. If I remember right, your paper didn't really identify a family structure per se as being crucial to mobility, but you did find something relating to employment rates among fathers. Did I read that correctly? Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I think so, James. I think what we're able to say from these data is that at a very high level, we can explain what's going on with kids when we look at kind of conditions in the prior generation in the area in which those kids are growing up. So one way to come at this is through thinking about employment rates, which is kind of the baseline measure we use. But the, harsh reality is that the parts of the US where, joblessness is now prevalent are really in many cases the same place where things like marriage rates are lowest and family dissolution is highest and so on. And we're not really able to tease these factors apart to ask, say, for children, are you better off growing up in a place with lots of jobs but low marriage rates, or a place with high marriage rates and not a lot of jobs? So these things often move together and we don't attempt to take them apart. But what we do want to say at a high level is that you can really explain what happens kind of in this generation if you look back at what's going on in the prior generation in terms of where folks are actually locally growing up. And in terms of how things have changed for different groups, so as I mentioned, there's been kind of this broad decline in employment for lower income white parents that we can then map locally into outcomes for their children. Interestingly, what we see in the data is that for other groups, so Black children born to lower income parents, white children born to higher income parents, they react to changes in employment rates of the prior generation in almost the exact same way. That is to say, it's true for both low income white and Black children that they tend to do better as adults if they're growing up in communities where parents of their own race and class background are working at higher rates, are married at higher rates, and so on. But what's distinct over this period is kind of how employment rates and how these communities have evolved for these different groups. So in particular, what you see in the data is that these sharp declines in employment rates have really been concentrated in lower income white communities, whereas the employment rates in these lower income Black communities have evolved in a much more positive way and are improving in many areas of the US. So, one way to summarize that set of facts is conditions in the prior generation, matter very similarly for kids, regardless of race and class background. It's just in the last 20 years, those conditions themselves have evolved differently for these different groups.
And I found one thing in your paper really interesting that I just want to give you a chance to emphasize. You even mentioned that the age at which children experience those kinds of environmental factors, it matters. Is that right?
Yeah. So what we're doing there is by looking at age exposure to these different factors, in some sense, that's a tool we're able to use to establish that it's childhood environment that itself that matters. So it's helpful to set this up by just thinking about a family who moves across areas once during a kid's childhood, and imagine the family is moving to a place where conditions are worsening for the prior generation, right? If you move with a kid who's 6, that child is going to spend, most of their childhood in that destination area. Whereas if you move with a child who's 16 or 17, they're going to get very little exposure to that area before it's time to either go to college or join the workforce. And what we see in the data is that this measure I've been talking about with James, employment rates in the prior generation, or other ways like marriage rates to measure the health of a community, that really only matters for outcomes if kids spend a substantial portion of their childhood in that area. So for children who move at, say, 17 or 18 to these areas that are quote unquote declining, we actually see very little relationship with that decline in their own future income. But for children who move when they're 7, 8 years old or even younger, who spend a lot of their childhood in this destination, what you end up seeing is that earnings really end up being sensitive for those kids to what is going on in the community in the destination county.
One of the conclusions your paper comes to is that social interaction within race and class groups is a major factor that shapes economic mobility. And I wanted to let you kind of elaborate on that a little bit and then explain why or why not any of that could be explained by other factors like structural factors or deindustrialization and policy changes. So if you wanted to just elaborate on that conclusion a little bit.
So there's a question we've been talking a lot about, okay, for kids growing up in areas where conditions for the prior generation, their parents' generations are worse, how does that end up kind of predicting or mapping on to kids' outcomes in the future? And there's a question I think that kind of raises is whose kind of conditions or which community in a sense, right? Is it about all the parents, in a given area? Is it about parents of your own race and class group and so on? And so that it's cutting the data in those particular ways that lead us to believe that the relationship between kind of community conditions or employment rates for the parental generation and kids' future outcomes is somehow related to social interaction. And I'll tell you why or what in the data has led us to that belief. It's that if you cut the data by looking at who kids are most likely to be friends with socially, what you see is it's really the parents of those folks that end up having, there's this relationship between the outcomes of those parents in terms of their employment rates and their marriage rates with your own outcomes. So one way to do that is by looking at differences in age, right? So if you think about your own experience in high school or grade school, you were probably, much more likely to be friends with someone in your own grade than you were, say, 3 or 4 years older than you. And when we look in the data and ask, well, okay, if the employment rates or marriage rates of the parents of kids in your own grade decline, how does that end up relating to your outcomes compared to what happens if the employment rates of the parents 3 or 4 years older than you or younger than you decline? And what you see is what really comes out of the data is it's the conditions of the parents of kids you're most likely to socially interact with that have the most predictive power for your own outcomes.
Are there particular community institutions that are effective at creating this kind of social interaction, in a positive direction? And I'm thinking obviously schools might be, but schools don't always seem to do a really good job of this. Are there other institutions within a community that we can say, hey, these types of institutions seem to facilitate the types of interactions amongst people of various race and social class and such that produce upward positive mobility?
That's the key question, James. So I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head there. What I'd say is that the best answer I can give you is actually from a different, distinct set of research that I was not directly involved in myself, but was also carried out by the Opportunity Insights team. And that was using data from Facebook to try and understand relationships and friendships across class boundaries. And there was two, in my opinion, important sets of facts. There were many important facts that came out of those research, but two kind of come to mind in response to your question there. The first is that if we look across the US and ask, okay, where are the areas where low-income kids go on to do really well and kind of achieve the American dream? One factor in particular really stands out as kind of closely relating to those mobility outcomes. And that's what, is termed these cross-class friendships. So it's in particular the areas of the US where people seem to socially interact across class boundaries. Those tend to be the same places that have really strong rates of upward mobility for kids from low-income families. And I think we have a lot of work to do to understand how to foster those relationships, whether there's something special about those relationships themselves, or it's just the types of places that have those relationships are good in other ways. But a couple facts from that paper, I think, help get us started, which is you can decompose in some sense and ask, well, what are the social groups or places where people tend to have these types of class-cutting interactions? And two that in particular stand out are actually religious groups, which, as many folks know, have been broadly kind of church participation and other formal religious participation has actually been on the decline in the US, or at least now it's, I think, steadying or even increasing, but was on the decline for many decades. But religious institutions actually tend to be one of these places that cut across class boundaries. And another, interesting example is actually recreational leagues and sports, coming full circle to our topic at the beginning of our conversation.
Interesting. That's I'd really like to delve into that a little bit more, but we have to move on, and we've got some.
You're really generous with your time, but before we let you go, I definitely wanted to spend at least a last couple of minutes on some of your other work. You have another interesting paper that's called "Bachelors Without Bachelors," which just works great on a podcast. So let me explain to listeners. The second bachelors has an apostrophe. So bachelors as in unmarried persons without bachelor's degrees. Okay. In that paper, you and your co-authors explore changing marriage patterns in America. And what's interesting is that you find that those patterns do seem to have relation to people with college or without college education. Before we get into the details there, could you just talk about how marriage patterns have changed, like in general, over the past 50 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you referenced, probably the biggest contribution of this paper is the creative title, but that you've dug into. So I'm happy to get into the facts as well. I've set the bar too high for future paper titles, so everybody should bring their expectations down. But I think we know from work many others in the field have done, including perhaps most notably Melissa Carney, that marriage rates have been declining for a while in the U.S. They've been declining because people are kind of never getting married, not because people are getting married and divorced necessarily. And they've been declining predominantly among working class Americans or Americans without college degrees. What the focus of the new paper is really about is to ask, well, kind of what is the relationship between those changes and the fact that there's now these kind of large and growing gender gaps in college attendance? So if we actually look today at four-year colleges and universities in the US, there's about 1.5 million more boys on those campuses than girls. And we know historically that college educated folks kind of tend to marry each other. So the combination of these factors, I think, raises a natural question, which is, what is going to happen in the marriage market in a sense when there's really not enough college educated men to go around?
That is a trend that I've seen a lot written on, both, in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education and some other places as the declining rates of college attendance among men. And so I've read some other stuff, more in popular areas, not too much academic research, but on will there be a lot of these college educated women who don't have spouses? But that's not necessarily, I think, what your paper found, if I understood it right. Right. So you highlight that these changing marriage rates in America seem to are related to college education, but who's getting married and who's not, and why? What's happening there?
Yeah, so now I think we're coming first full circle again to some of those like attunement to class dynamics we started off talking about, which is part of what kind of motivated us to write this paper. I should say this is joint work with Joe Winkleman, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Clara Chambers, who's at the Tobin Center at Yale. Part of what was motivating us here was actually a ton of media and recent articles talking about how difficult it is for college women to date and marry right now, precisely because of this shortage. Often mentioned alongside these trends are growing gender divides in politics, but a key factor that's coming back, people are coming back to time and time again is, well, college educated women, they really want to marry someone with a college degree, and there's just simply, not enough college educated men to go around. But what happens when you look at the data is that nothing at all has really changed, even in the last 50 years, about marriage rates for college educated women. So this kind of poses a bit of a puzzle. There's now not enough kind of college educated men for them to marry, yet their marriage rates have been completely stable. So like what is adding up here? And what you see if you look at the data is that in response to the growing kind of shortage of college educated men, college educated women have started to marry non-college men in higher and higher numbers. But it's really not any kind of non-college guy. They tend to marry the kind of higher earning or relatively well-off non-college men. So the story is that college educated women, their marriage rates have been largely stable because they've responded to this shortage by a few of them are now starting to marry kind of higher earning non-college men. But what's happened for kind of everybody else in a sense is amongst the pool of non-college men, one that's a group, as has been well written about, that has had a lot of struggle in the past few decades, including in the labor market. And then two, a decent sized chunk of them are now marrying these college educated women. And so from the perspective of non-college women, these trends have combined to seriously impact kind of their pool of potential partners. And it's for them, the non-college women, that is who the declines in marriage rates have really been concentrated amongst. And so the paper is really kind of trying to reposition these two trends to say, yes, men are falling behind in college enrollment, but it's actually maybe surprisingly really not the college educated women who, at least to date, are bearing the cost of that change in the marriage market. Things have kind of reshuffled a bit such that it's really non-college women who are getting married at lower and lower rates.
That's interesting. What do you expect to see happen if those trends continue, those marriage rate trends continue?
Yeah, so it's useful to ask, exactly that question, James, because these growing gender gaps in college enrollment really show no signs of letting up. I think we're going to soon, I guess no guarantees, but it's possible we'll get to a place within the next couple of decades where there's effectively two women on college campuses for every one guy. And so it's worth asking, what is that going to do to these marriage trends? And of course, there's no way to, no way to predict the future, or predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. But I think one hint you can kind of get is by this fact that college women seem to be reacting to this by kind of cutting into the non-college pool, if you will, suggests that this trend might continue to widen these education gaps in marriage. But B, perhaps more concretely, what you can do is look at outcomes earlier in life for more recent cohorts. So if you look at, say, women born in the mid-90s, one can ask, well, if we measure the rates at which they're already married or cohabiting with unmarried partners at, say, age 25 or 30, can we use that to forecast the future trajectory of their marriage rates? And so in that paper, the data really run from the women born in 1930 to women born in 1980. But using this method of looking at outcomes earlier in life, we're able to effectively push those data out another 15 or 20 years. And when you do that, you get exactly this picture where we expect these education gaps in marriage to actually continue widening in the next 10 or 15 years.
I really need to get Benny and Melissa Kearney and Claudia Golden together in the same room and hash out, because they all come at this slightly different directions, but they're all hitting on some of the exact same things. And I find this entire line of research fascinating and highly interesting. And I think it does have impact on economic outcomes, policy directions, those kinds of things. So I'm gonna work on that.
Remind me, Kearney is the two-parent advantage, right?
Yes, okay, right.
Two-parent privilege.
Yeah. Privilege.
I love that goal, James, because I know I always learn a lot when I'm in the room with the two of them. And obviously been very lucky to have Claudia as an advisor, but conversations with Melissa have been extremely important in forming the work on the new paper as well. So they've both been great and are kind of, as you mentioned, really the key players in this space.
I've read both of their most recent books and have been just, I could dig into those for a long time and get lost. Unfortunately, I have a dissertation to write. So
you should do that. But given their work, though, I get, that was helpful because given their work, the two papers we talked about today are more related than I would have thought just at first glance, which is why I actually do want to go back to the income mobility among children. Let me just like really hand over the power. I mean, let's just imagine I could hand you a magic wand right now and you could just wave it and make policy changes at fiat. What would you do for the sake of making upward mobility even better for children of all classes and races in America?
I think I'd do two things, one abstract and perhaps one more concrete. I think one abstract in terms of how to frame kind of what to do is just to ask from your own experience and perhaps the experiences of people you know, how does the upbringing or the lives of children born to upper middle class folks vary from folks in poor and struggling families and areas in the US? What are all the small kind of ways that advantage accumulates in a sense, whether it be, the type of school you go to, the teachers you have, how much time your parents have, whether they read to you, the food you're eating. So I think one way to frame this exercise is just to say, look, we know that a lot of the differences in outcomes that these two groups of folks will have later in life really come as a result of these earlier in life experiences. What can we take just from looking almost sociologically at one group versus the other and ask, are there sets of policies that can kind of bring the upper middle class life, if you will, at least in certain ways, such as school quality and so on, to kids born into tougher circumstances? I think practically one thing one can do to help achieve that is to focus on reducing segregation in many ways. So coming back to this point with James about cross-class interactions and so on, I think it's, can be difficult to focus on particular policies or like, should we do this in schools? Is it all about this in neighborhoods and so on? Likely this is kind of an overdetermined disparity and there's a lot, going on at one time. But I wonder if by bringing people together a bit more, whether that be, in neighborhoods, in marriages, in schools and so on, these things kind of will start fixing themselves over time, if you will. if we align the interests of these different groups, right? Right now, when we live these very segregated lives and you're unlikely to go to school with folks of different economic backgrounds and so on, it's easy to kind of invest in schools for upper middle class kids and not for kids from other backgrounds and so on. So I wonder in some sense if really the secret here, this is more editorializing than, something I know from the data, is just to bring people together a bit more and intertwine our own interests and incentives.
In political science, we often talk about institutions of civil society. And I think when those institutions are functioning well, you get that kind of cross-class, cross-social boundaries, interactions that don't seem to work as well all the time in certain communities as maybe we would like them to do. So I find that very interesting. Now,
time for the secret question.
We have one final question. No pressure, but your response will determine which of us calls you friend for life and which will never want to talk to you again. So don't worry about it. Do you want to? I'm going to give you the honors of asking the question.
Okay, I'll do it. Yeah. All right, Benny. If you were to leave here right now, having only two options, which would you choose? Your options are to immediately sign off from the podcast and go watch an episode of 30 Rock, or to go watch an episode of Seinfeld. Which one would you pick?
Oh, Seinfeld. That's not even close. It's not even close. As a secular New York Jew, I was raised at way too early of an age on Curb Your Enthusiasm. And I did not get the full part of my kind of Seinfeld New York Jewish education that I should have gotten, solely because I'm a little too young for the Seinfeld heyday. And, I often get criticized by friends, family, even colleagues when I don't understand Seinfeld references. So I need to do my Seinfeld homework.
Put one more on the notch for Seinfeld.
I am poorly losing at this point, yes.
Well, our guest today has been Dr. Benjamin Goldman, Assistant Professor of Economics at the Jeb Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University. Benny, we sure appreciate your time. This has been a fantastic conversation, I believe. And you've been very generous with sharing your insights on income mobility, marriage, and such. And so thank you again for visiting with us today.
Yes, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, folks, see you next time. Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.